I'd like to start with a little story that happened 7 years ago. And it's a very nice story, as you can see with the colors. 7 years ago, we've been very successful. It was a very successful company. And you could also see that with external metrics. We've been a recognized market leader in a very specific market niche in the call center industry. And we were also international. We've grown a lot over the years between 1995 and 2007. And we ended up with an organization of 250 employees. Pretty engineering focused, so it's been a software company. But there have been also some departments with support activities and implementation services activities and of course sales activities. And ultimately everything worked so well that we've been also able to go public. So Envision at that time went public 2007, Prime Standard. It was in general a serious business. And it was not only serious, everything within the company was really great. And usually those stories don't turn out as they sound in the beginning. So we could really question whether everything was great. In fact, it wasn't. That's complete bullshit. Whenever you hear such a story, it's usually not great. In fact, we've been in deep shit in various regards within our company. And one of the reasons for that was that we implemented a process which you could call sales-driven development. So pretty simple. Whenever the sales department or an account manager was able to get a deal by promising new things, he was doing so. So there was a certain routine in getting to customers and telling about new features, new products, the future roadmap and things like that, and then getting back to the engineering team and telling them, look, this is what I've sold, now go implement it. And that led to a second process, which was a dominant element later on in the game, which I would call deadline-driven development. So those sales-driven elements turned out to be always attached to a certain timeline. So whenever a sales guy promises that something will come in future, the immediate reaction of the customer was, okay, and when will I get it? And then there was some game to find out when this will happen. And you all know that. You can never predict when a product will be ready or finished, and typically a product is never finished. So that was giving us a lot of constraints, external constraints, sometimes also contractual constraints that didn't let us develop our own plan how to do things. And the main product was also rotten. It got rotten over time. We had a product that started out in the early 90s, and it was written, as you did at that time, in full-blown C++. There were also some ASM statements here and there, but it was a business product. So we've been adding features over time without really refactoring and without getting to a proper modern design. It was just tumors that were growing, and giving us a hard time after a while. And it was all together in one big monolithic architecture. So C++, about 100 engineers working on C++ code in one common code base in a monolithic architecture, no separation of concerns all over the place, and that led in general to a big ball of mud. So it was really totally horrible to touch that product and to change things and to make sure that it was still working after having changed something. And well, as you can imagine, That also affected stability. So we got into a routine of finding out whether a bug that was reported is important or not. The so-called unimportant bugs had been pushed into a bug backlog that was growing over time. And after a while, it was just a matter of which customer is shouting the loudest in order to get something into the product or got something fixed. So with that big backlog of bugs and instability and shouting customers and external constraints, external deadlines and sales-driven development, this in total led to no innovation at all. Innovation had stalled in 2007, 2008 because of that big network of constraints that we've imposed on ourselves. And if you don't have any innovation, and if you don't have a proper, solid and stable product with a huge number of bugs, then customers get unhappy. That was the ultimate consequence of that. So if you compare that, a very pink description from the outside and stalled innovation from the inside, what could you do in such a situation? Obviously, someone is doing something wrong. So one measure could be to just add more managers. And this is what happened actually. If you look up in a traditional playbook of companies, you'll quickly come to organizational charts. You quickly come to something like controlling and counting numbers, counting hours, counting money, internal charges, and things like that. And in order to manage this, you of course need to have managers. And with managers, there comes also a set of side effects that happen more or less automatically. There is micromanagement, there is bureaucracy. So we've had a couple of forms in order to ask for things in the company that we've never had before we introduced a proper layer of management to it. Little kingdoms, finger pointing, it was always someone else's fault, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, it was no fun. So it wasn't great, it was shit, and nobody was really enjoying working there, me included. And that was especially horrible because it started out in a completely different fashion. When we started Envision back in '95, it was a small team, there was no bureaucracy, and it was mainly fun-driven. We were engineering-driven, we were fun-driven, and we didn't take care of the commercial aspects of it in general. And having that picture still in mind, but a completely different situation at that time, we had to do something. And basically, there have been two options. Selling the whole shit to some legacy, big evil enterprise company would have been one, or the other one, changing things for good. And as the founders of Envision all had a very strong engineering background, we'd applied some principles that you can also find in hacking a software product or hacking an IT system that we've applied to our organization here. Yeah, good morning again. Peter Bollenbeck. My GitHub and Twitter handle is pbollenbeck usually, and the email is listed here. When I put together the slides for the first time, I didn't know that there was even an RFC definition of what a hacker is. Did you know that? RFC 1392 defines what a hacker is. And actually, it's not so bad. It's emphasizing on two elements here. There is an intimate understanding of things that are going on, and secondly, it's talking about a system that needs to be hacked or that is being hacked. There is the reference to computers and computer networks, of course, but it says in particular, so you can according to that definition at least, apply hacking tactics also to any other system, including an organization. And then, well, you have the usual sources, Richard Stallman in this case. One very important factor is also that you don't have that much respect when hacking anything, including your organization. So the term or the word fuck, together with any other subject attached to it, is your best friend when hacking your own organization. So fuck it, fuck this, fuck that, is something that you would have heard a lot when we started that whole change within our company. And there is another aspect that's also pretty important, and that's a spirit of playful cleverness. So playing around with the different mechanics within an organization, playing around with new ideas, trying things out, finding out that things work and don't work is a very important factor. It's not just reading a certain playbook and applying things that you've heard somewhere. It's thinking on your own and making sure that you really have a good feedback loop in order to find out whether something is working or not. So these were the three main elements that we had in mind or that we used implicitly when we hacked our own organization. But there is a very important difference to a software system or an IT system that you could hack as well, and that's the feedback loop. Especially if you think of test-driven development, takes some time. You never find out immediately whether something works that you've started. It takes some days at least before you get some kind of feedback. Sometimes it takes also weeks, months, or even years. We are still seeing results from things that we've applied or changed a couple of years ago, which only kick in now. And that's pretty unusual if you're used to, if you take a typical RSpec, test-driven development cycle, you hack in your specification, it's red, then you code, it's green, and then you can refactor. And this happens usually within a couple of seconds or a couple of milliseconds. This is not the case if you hack your organization. You have to take time, you have to be patient, a lot more patient than you would usually be in developing a software system. And the second difference is we are working with people in an organization. So this is not necessarily deterministic in terms of behavior. So sometimes it's a bit erratic. Sometimes, I would say practically always, you have to deal with emotions. And this is something which is also a major difference in looking at an organizational system in comparison to an IT system or a software system. So since 2007 or 2008, we've applied probably hundreds of different hacks. And I could fill 2 days with it easily. I've put together just a bunch of them, which had some very dramatic effects on our organization. And I'd like to show those 4 or 5 now. So the first hack is what we call leave the Borg. Everybody knows the Borg. A nice unit within the enterprise universe or the Star Trek universe, and this is one of my favorite quotes within that environment. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. And the Borgs, in our sense, have been a bunch of companies that we've been attached to. So when we started in '95, there was practically no way around the classic Microsoft environment. And with the Microsoft environment, there also came some other legacy products that we simply had to use because our customers were using that. So IBM was in the game, Oracle was in the game. We've even introduced SAP for ERP internally after a while, and some others. And the problem with those products, or using those products internally, is that you not only get the functionality, you also import some other aspects. You import philosophy, you import structure that those vendors impose on you, and you import those processes which are typically found in larger organizations that use those products. So there's a certain ecosystem that influenced how those products are being used, and there is an underlying implicit philosophy, structure, and set of processes that you tend to use as well, or that you tend to implement as well. And this is usually for large, badass enterprise companies. And that's not necessarily the right choice for a small and agile software company. So with using the products, you get something that you don't want to have. And that has an effect also on your innovation speed. If you always think in terms of upgrade cycles and bug backlogs of those large companies, you tend to behave in a very similar fashion, also with regards to your own innovation speed. So leaving the Borg means that you're free to choose something else, but that comes also with an obligation, which is very important. You have to think on your own. And this is actually not an inconvenience. We saw that as a chance to really do things in a different fashion and do things in a fashion that worked for us and not for that big, badass, large enterprise companies. So we took down all of those systems that we've used or that we've assembled over time and replaced them with something that was very special purpose, that was open source in general. So that was a major part of our replacement strategy. Some of them were pretty easy to introduce. Some of them were very difficult to introduce. So we are still using, for example, SAP for our bookkeeping and resource planning in general. We are trying to get rid of that by the end of this year. But once you have such a system installed, it's very difficult to get rid of it. So these projects of replacing legacy systems can take a while, up to 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Similar story with Git. We've introduced Git when we switched to a Ruby on Rails based stack for the majority of our web applications. And it was very difficult to migrate also our legacy product to Git. So we've been using another SCM in the game. And migrating something over to Git is not as easy as it sounds, especially if you have 3 million lines of code and a very mature, let's put it that way, environment, how you compile things. And actually, Vim is not a dogma. This is just one of the editors that people are using internally. You earn something or you get something when you leave the Borg. You have to think on your own, but you get agility, a lot more agility, because that environment is typically very hot, and you can't rely on things to stay the same over time. That's completely different. So you have to be agile to adopt those systems. You spend a lot less overhead because you don't have to obey weird processes that are imposed on you, and you get back to a very native flow of innovation, and that increases innovation speed. Second hack, remove suits. These are the 3 founders right at the IPO day. It's good that the sunlight is shining on my face here. Armand, Matthias, and myself, we actually never looked like that in private. That was just a disguise in order to appear as a professional enterprise that is really suitable for being public. And the saying, clothes make the man, is something that has a lot of reality and a lot of impact in the general business world. With wearing a suit, you can pretend to be someone else. And that happened at Envision internally and externally a couple of times. So I would say 30–40% of people in our own organization in 2007 were wearing suits and ties. And that was also a method in order to separate the managers from the people who are working. The suit was also often used in order to weaken rational arguments. So if some people or if two people were discussing about a certain situation, you would have seen the suit winning because of the fact that the separation of management and people who are working led to a hierarchy and also a hierarchy of arguments, regardless whether those arguments are right or not. So we've removed the suits. Well, started internally, but also rolled that out also to our appearance at trade shows and things like that. And ultimately also meetings with investors, bankers and things like that don't happen with suits anymore. Everybody can appear as he or she likes. And that changed over a long time also the internal discussion culture. So we had, after a while, more real people. Also some people left because they liked to wear suits and to have that separation, that artificial separation. But we've also created a lot more rational thinking, in my opinion. At least there was a correlation between the increase in rational thinking and the decrease in the number of suits that we've had on board. And then in general, it was also a far more relaxed attitude, a better flow also in the corporation. I've spoken about managers before. With managers, typically also a set of titles or business card elements appear at the same time. So when we were in 2007, we had a complete zoo, a large group of different titles in our organization. I don't know how many in total, but I would guess we had as many titles, especially if you add senior and junior to that set as a permutation, as many titles as people. And that doesn't make sense at all. I mean, what's up with those titles? First of all, they set up easily little fences. You are able to say things like, "This is not my job," because it's not in my title description or not in my job description. So titles in general, especially if you have that fine granularity that we've had at that time, make sure that you prohibit collaboration. Because it's very easy to say, "This is not my job, this is not in my job description." So we've removed those titles, which was not easy. Especially people with a senior attached to it, or with something that sounds like manager or executive blah-de-blah-de-blah, don't like to get their title removed. So that looks like, oh, now I have to get back to work. How come? It took some years. We have practically removed all titles now within the company, and the results are better collaboration. So there is not that "this is not my job" principle deployed anymore, and a lot of thinking out of the box. So you can put together teams that come from different disciplines, and looking at a problem from various angles definitely enforces the problem solution capabilities. We've removed titles and we've killed the kings. And kings is the representation for managers in this case. We've had, I think, 3 levels of hierarchy back in 2007. I think there is there must be a website where you can type in your number of employees and you get, as a result, the number of hierarchies that you automatically have. And there is a problem with hierarchy in general. That's the Peter principle. Probably 80% of you know that. Every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence. So you get promoted when you're competent until you reach the level where you're no longer being promoted, and that means that you've reached your level of competence or exceeded your level of competence. And in general, you could say, if you don't have trust, you need to have management. If you don't trust in your people, if you don't trust in abilities, if you don't trust in good collaboration and rational thinking, you need to control. So you need to have a controlled structure, and you need to have people who execute that structure. What we did was we asked managers to go back to work, to join the teams, to relearn programming if necessary, to get back to operational sales activities or consulting activities and things like that. And guess what? I would say 80% didn't like that at all. So that had a very dramatic effect on our headcount in general. People left because they've been asked to work again. And whenever some of those people left, we had to take a decision: do we recruit someone else in order to fill the gap? Or, and that was the second thinking, is there a gap now? So what happened typically was that we didn't fill the gap because there wasn't any gap, and we tried to arrange teams in a slightly different way so that it worked without management. So after a while, that was also a process that happened over 3, 4, 5, 6 years. We came to a very native agile structure, so most of them left, and some mechanisms that make sure that our teams are synchronized across the board or across the company. And this is the only thing that we do. There is, for example, a common group-wide bi-weekly sprint review where everyone within the company is encouraged to attend. So all teams are looking at all of the artifacts that the other teams have produced over 2 weeks. And that leads to an automatic synchronization of work and also a propagation of best practices throughout the teams. So main results: a lot of more creativity. If you remove control, creativity will blossom. This is an effect that we've seen. And also less bureaucracy. So this is a self-enforcing cycle. Less managers, less bureaucracy, and then you need less managers in order to handle the bureaucracy. The fifth hack that I'd like to present is called Shrink the Team. And this is something which is slightly different to the ones I've explained before. So we haven't really changed the organizational structure, but we've been playing around with some organizational elements of it. So we tried out different team sizes and tried to find out what is the behavior that is created based on the team size. Can we measure somehow the output? Can we try to find out what the reasons for different output is, or what the reasons for different output are when you change a team size? And coincidentally, the teams have gotten smaller over time. So we started out with teams that have been in the 5 to 10 people category. And when we looked at those teams, we found out that there was a small waterfall implemented within the team. So specialized roles, people doing kind of specification work or business analyst work, and then handing work off to designers, and then handing work off to developers, and then handing work off to people who take care of software quality and things like that. And whenever we got that smaller, the teams got a lot more agile. So those small waterfalls that we originally had in those teams disappeared completely automatic. We didn't need to enforce that. That happened just by shrinking the teams. So the general conclusion was smaller teams work better. On the other hand, we're currently in a situation where we are still playing around with it. And we have some teams that are slightly growing. So we've upgraded the upper limit from 3 people to 4 people now in order to find out whether there are certain circumstances where also slightly larger teams work better than smaller teams. So this is an ongoing process. But in comparison, if you take the big picture, a team of 3 people usually provides a better absolute output as a team of 10 people. And for small teams, it's also pretty easy to share one vision. If you have to synchronize 10 people within one product team, it can get a bit messy in order to stay synchronized all the time. And with a small group of highly qualified people, it's also easier to develop some kind of determination. If you have a common vision, and if you like what you're doing, then you get determined to reach your goals. And that is also pretty difficult if the team is large or larger. So in general, the results here were that conflicts didn't appear anymore. So there wasn't the necessity for an external instance, if you like, to watch conflicts and to resolve conflicts and things like that, because that happens automatically in small teams. We've introduced a lot more streamlined communication within the organization. And we've removed also the internal waterfall, so there wasn't any handoff between different teams or sub-teams, which also improves the general workflow. So there are some lessons that we've learned during the course of the past 5 or 6 years. And one is that if you hack your organization, you should do that not with droids. So people that obey the rules and follow the existing processes and do what they've been told to do are not good companions in hacking the organization. So when we've started out with a small kernel to change things, we've taken a look at the non-droids, more the rebels and the people who got rogue from time to time. That were the far better companions in hacking your own organization. And then a second general advice that we've developed over time is that you don't need to think out things to the very ending. Sometimes it's just okay if you throw a bomb, if you know what happens to an extent of 80% or anything like that, and then just let it happen and handle the fallout afterwards. This is far better instead of trying to think ahead for a long time and trying to find out what the bits and pieces could be that could happen. If you get to it with a very agile attitude, you should usually be able to handle the fallout afterwards. The only thing you have to make sure is that the bomb doesn't detonate in your own office. That shouldn't happen. And the last thing is, hacking or org hacking is very fractal. You can zoom in and you'll find things that you can improve or you can change or you can playfully explore, and you can zoom out, and also in the big picture there are a lot of things that can be changed and completely modified and hacked in general. So an organizational system consists of a lot of very small pieces, and when you zoom into them, you find even more smaller pieces inside it, and some large elements. And you have to tackle both in order to make sure that that gets to a complete picture. And that's the third advice that I'd have. And that's the end of the talk. Any questions? Well, for our product development department, it mainly happens through that sprint review that we have every 2 weeks. So that's typically 2 or 3 hours. It starts on a Friday in the morning. It's a big WebEx, so we have a distributed development environment, 3 offices, 2 in Germany and 1 in Northern Ireland. And every team presents in the context of the entire product suite, and all the other teams take a look at that. And by just making this transparent, where are specific teams going, you'll find native boundaries between components, for example. And you also see emerging potential abstractions. So when 2 teams show similar things, there is obviously some room for an abstraction or a gem that you can pull out, or even a different SOA component that you need to get in place in order to operate with the other components. So showing everything to everyone is the way to go to make sure that the teams are aligned. We also have a core mission in our company, which is not written down, but which is part of the general overall thinking. And that develops also over time. So it's also depending on external factors. And that's the main reason why we didn't write that down, to make sure that we stay flexible also within our general mission. So everyone is looking practically on every single bit and piece that we are developing to make sure that it doesn't deviate from the general route. So it's a common exercise, if you like. Of course, there are people who talk more, and there are others who talk less, and some are more interested in getting everything aligned. I think that's natural, but in general, it's a team effort. Yeah, well, there is a lot more collaboration, and before it was more giving an order or something like that to a different department. So now people are sitting together and trying to find out what customers really need, and then we develop things. And only if we've developed them, or after we've developed them and launched them, we make that available to customers. We try to do that as often as possible and as early as possible, but we are not selling promises anymore. I think that is the main change. There is no roadmap. Occasionally, customers still ask for a roadmap, and the ultimate answer is we don't have a roadmap. We can't really say what will happen or what will be released in 2 or 3 years' time. This is unpredictable. That depends on so many factors that you really can't keep that under control. There is also less sales going on and less custom, I would say, unscalable work being done. So whenever we get aware of a requirement or problem at a customer, we try to solve that in such a way that this can be replicated also for other customers. So we try to make things very scalable, and that should enable everyone to solve problems with the standard means without going into any customizations or custom developments or anything like that. Especially with that throw a bomb and handle the fallout tactics, you sometimes have to handle shit and things getting worse before they get better. But breaking up a structure is usually the prerequisite, especially if you have some very old and rotten structures, is the prerequisite to build something new upon it. And you always have to weigh between the 2 options. Is it worthwhile maintaining the structures for a while in order to keep things going? And that's what we've done in some departments for a long time. If you think of bookkeeping, for example, they are still running their Dell laptops, or Dell workstations actually. They are still using SAP by the end of the year, and then we are rid of that as well. There was also, for a long time, still a command and control structure in there, just to make sure that we are meeting our external reporting obligations, that we don't mess up with German bookkeeping requirements and things like that. So we didn't throw a bomb there. That was a conscious decision. We started out in the development department, and looking at the trend to agility, the general trend to agility, it was very easy or easier to find people with the right mindset in the development department to start out from there. And then we made those shells larger over time. So we tried to include other departments into that new structure, coming from that very small kernel. And, well, then we had the mixture of throwing the bomb and keeping the old stuff. Well, obviously that's a lot more difficult. If there is someone who says no, and there is someone who has the power to say no and whatever, stop money and impose punishment and things like that, you would probably have a hard time. So the general advice from my side would be to get someone who buys in, and that's probably from within the development department, or easier from within the development department. There are a lot of good resources and also scientific research on productivity of developers in certain environments. So taking this fact-based approach to a manager or a soon-to-be former manager, potentially, is I think is the must or is the prerequisite in order to get some room, even if this is a small room in the beginning, to change things. And once you are in that mode, you have you have a small space where you can navigate and where you can change things. You can tell a story by comparing what happened before and what are the results now. And when you have a success story, it's far easier to sell that internally. So then it can be propagated to another department or into another team or anything like that. Ultimately, it all boils down to results. Especially the higher you go to the hierarchy, you would probably show something that is very tangible. And I think we are, as software developers, we are all in the habit of measuring things and comparing things and providing some statistics about elements. And when you have that, it should be a no-brainer. You're still dealing with people, so there are still emotions. There is still being proud of a certain manager status or anything like that. So that needs to be incorporated as well. But in the long run, nothing speaks against facts. Well, I think a certain fuck it attitude helps, as I said before. Then coming from a development background, I think was very important. And also still having in mind that it was fun before and it was horrible at a certain point in time. And wanting to get back to the fun situation and removing the horrible situation, I think was the main driver to get things going. Well, there is no management anymore. So I'm actually coding, or I have been coding a lot. So I'm sitting in one of the feature teams. I have my regular commits. I have my git revert when I commit shit. So that's the same, absolutely the same level as everyone else. I had to force myself to let things go. I think there is always a certain feeling of having things under control when you give directions or when you give order, and finding out that you can remove it and actually improve the results is something that you have to try out, and you have to force yourself to do so. If you don't do that, you'll never find out. So that playful exploration and fuck it mindset again helps, but you have to do it at least once, and you have to experience the effects or the results. Otherwise, you'll never get into a habit of distributing power, I would say. But that's the personal. That's my personal impression. We've also seen that a lot of people had massive problems with letting it go or just distributing power, and that usually led to people leaving Envision, leaving the company in a very emotional fuck up. So our feature teams are usually between 2 and 4 people, and let's say the best practice currently applied with us is that we either have pair programming and then check-ins or commits go directly against master, and also there is a continuous delivery pipeline, so we also push that or propagate that through then to a staging environment, and also from staging then to a production or to the production environment. And that happens, I would say 50% of the time, and the other 50% are especially larger features where someone is working on that alone, are created in a feature branch, submitted as a pull request, and then another team member or 2 other team members take a look at that, discuss it, apply changes, work on obeying the style guidelines and things like that, and then merge that pull request also into master. So we try to avoid branches as much as possible, and we've seen over time that we've removed a staging branch and a development branch, a general development branch in the past. We are very happy in committing to master as often as possible, and also propagating to a production or to the production environment as often as possible. So this is happening currently, I would say, around 30 to 40 times across the board per day to deploy on production. Well, there is no institution. There is, I would say, an implicit network of people who also defocus on purpose. So not only take a look at their own team, but also take a look what happens in another team, in another site, in another country, and so on and so forth. And this is, I would say, if you would visualize that, it would be a network. And I don't have a complete grasp of how the network looks like, but there is definitely a network. And you have personalities who like to help and who like to get engaged and to who well, again, on purpose, take a look also on other projects and on other things. And well, we are trying, or we have tried to establish a culture, and that's still an ongoing process, where we encourage just getting things done. And if someone sees that there is a problem somewhere else, as there is no title, as there is no real department boundary anymore, you would just sit together and then talk about the problem and try to get it solved somehow. I'm not saying that this is perfectly working right now, and there is an ongoing, as I said before, there are still some implicit hierarchies that are also remains from what we've had before, and we can see that here and there, but that is getting less over time. So this is another, I think, good example for the very long feedback loop that you have with organizational changes. It's not you change something and you get the feedback. It sometimes takes a couple of years and a continuous effort to make sure that the culture you'd like to have is really lived in order to come to something which is better than before. It's a very fuzzy answer, I know, but this is a fuzzy topic. Well, I think this boils down to what you measure. And we are measuring at a very high level, aggregated fashion, usage. So the theory behind this is that if people use our application, there is obviously something in it, some value in it. And the more value there is, the more usage you get. So the graph, it's Google Analytics, actually, we are totally obsessed about is unique sessions per day. And as long as this is going up, we are fine. If this is not going up or still hovering around a very low level, there is obviously no value in the product in order to make the customer use it. It might also well be that the customer is just not aware that there is some value in it. But this is also, we treat that also as a product defect. So the team is responsible to make aware that something is going on or something with value is there, and also responsible for the fact that there is something with value. And we've, I think there was one statement about total accountability or complete accountability about a certain component that starts from creating the vision and goes ultimately up to the adoption rate or usage metrics. And making teams being obsessed about usage, I think, is a good way to make them find ways to create value and to tell people that there is value. Also very fuzzy, and I would also agree if someone says, this is my theory how this should work. There are teams who work with that better. There are teams who work with it not that good. But this is having a certain trajectory, and it's going into the right direction. And as long as the trend is positive, we are totally fine.